and last class. Last class, we learned about Elisha ben Avuya, and we learned about the ban, why he was banned, some of the stories that led to his being excommunicated, banned, ostracized from the rabbinic or even Jewish community, and a little bit of his background and some of his teachings that may have tried to put together a portrait, a composite, as to who Elisha ben Avuya was, where he came from, where he may have erred, why things developed the way they did. And you can refer back to the shiurs available on YouTube as well as online as a link on the audio shiurim page of yih.org. Tonight, our featured figure to learn about and to explore is none other than Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, known many times in the Talmud as just as Rabbi Eliezer or Rabbi Eliezer Hagadol, the great Rabbi Eliezer. We're dealing with a heavyweight, a titan of Jewish learning among his peers. And similar to last time, we're going to take it in a similar approach. We are going to start with the story of the actual ban. There was a moment in time that there's a story that is the reason why Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus gets banned. After we see that story, which is actually a very long story, we'll deal with it in two parts. But then we're going to look a little bit about his background, about who he was, about some of his teachings, and try to put together a composite, an understanding of what happened, what went wrong, why did things devolve the way that they did, and what's the upshot? What are some of the lessons that we learned from Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, the excommunication, the cherem that he was subject to, as well as what do we learn from the circumstances surrounding that ban, and what is there any judgment made about Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus or about his peers, the other sages of the contemporaries of his that went ahead and put him into cherem, not only his contemporaries but also his students, which we'll see in a minute. So in the chat, I mentioned I provided the link. I'll do it one more time in case anyone doesn't have it. The link for the source sheet, but I'm also going to share my screen at this time. We're going to share my screen in a moment. Here we go. Okay, and what you should be able, you'll see, we have the story. We start with the story of the ban itself. What happened? What transpired that led to the excommunication, the cherem or the nidui? They're not exactly the same, but for our purposes, we're not going to get so halachically technical about what exactly the extent of the ban was. But he certainly, Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is banned. So before we learn about who he was, let's learn the story that leads to the ban. It's a very famous story in Talmud Bava Metzia, page 59a, that dealt with a very technical halachic issue about a tanur shel achnai. The tanur shel achnai was an earthenware stove type of appliance, and it was put together. It was put together in pieces. It wasn't one piece. It was put together in a number of pieces, and the question was whether that type of appliance is subject to becoming ritually impure. Can it mikabel tumah or not? And this was the discussion. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus felt that it was not subject to ritual impurity of tumah, whereas the rabbis, the sages, his peers, everyone else said otherwise. So first of all, let's look at the beginning of this source. I gave it to you in English. What is the relevance of achnai, a snake? The word achnai is understood to mean a snake. So Rabbi Yehuda said that Shmuel said it is characterized in that manner due to the fact that the rabbis surrounded it with their statements like this snake. Strophin forms a coil when at rest and deemed it impure. Right? In other words, the rabbis were, when you think about a snake that coils, it's in a defensive position that's about to attack and be on the offense. And that's as we see in the story as it unfolds, that's similar to the approach that the rabbis took against Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. On that day, when they discussed this matter, Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible answers in the world to support his opinion, but the rabbis did not accept his explanation. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was a minority opinion, so he was on the defensive. He was forced to explain himself as to why it is he felt that this Tano Shalachnai should be tahor, should not be able to be susceptible to Tuma. And he answered all the questions, but it didn't sway, it didn't convince his peers, the other sages of the time. So after failing, and that's what we see, that's where the story picks up, and that's an important background piece of information. We're at the top of the page. After failing to convince the rabbis logically, Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, the carob tree will prove it. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer was so convinced of the justness, of the correctness of his opinion, that he appealed that miracles should happen on his behalf to indicate that heaven, that divine intervention was on his side. So he said, let the carob tree prove that I am correct in my halachic opinion. The carob tree was uprooted from its place 100 cubits, and some say 400 cubits. In other words, so he said, if I'm right, the carob tree will jump. The carob tree jumped, right? So if I saw that, I would have been really impressed. However, the rabbis are not so impressed. The rabbis said, one does not cite halachic proof from the carob tree, right? And Rabbi Eliezer then goes and brings a number of other proofs from miracles that he predicts will happen to indicate, to support his minority opinion in the halacha, right? He says, let the water turn backwards. The water was flowing downstream. Let the water flow upstream. And that's exactly what happened when Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus said it would happen. And the rabbi said, no, we don't bring any proof from the direction of the water stream. Rabbi Eliezer said, if I'm correct, let the walls of the study hall prove that I'm correct. In other words, let the walls of the Beit Midrash fall in. So an interesting side point, if you read the story here, is that the walls started to lean and they began to fall, but they didn't completely fall, as if they were wavering. On the one hand, they wanted to indicate their support for Rabbi Eliezer by performing this miracle, but in deference to the majority opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus's peers, the walls did not fall completely. So there was this in between, and so we see that nature, that divine intervention is directing us, is encouraging Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus's peers to follow his minority opinion, but they're not swayed, right? And finally, Rabbi Eliezer then says, and here this is a famous line: if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, again he's the minority, a minority of one against all the other rabbis of his time, heaven will prove it. And then a bat kol, a divine voice, emerged from heaven and said, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer? The halacha is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses in his opinion. Right? So in other words, God himself, or a divine voice, a bat kol from heaven came down and said, right? Remember, we had a bat kol with Eliezer ben Avuya. Right? Eliezer ben Avuya felt that the bat kol, the divine voice, was telling him that he was not able to repent, right? Chutz me'acher, shuv, right? Return. Everyone can do tshuva except for Eliezer ben Avuya. But here the bat kol is in support, in defense of the minority of one position of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. So that's pretty compelling. And if I was part of that Beit Din that was disagreeing with Rabbi Eliezer, I might have had second thoughts when I heard a voice from heaven come down and tell us that the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer. But what does Rabbi Yeshua do? Rabbi Yeshua, who was the leader at the time, Rabbi Gamliel was the head of the Sanhedrin, but Rabbi Yeshua was leading the charge at that moment. He says, quoting the pasuk in Hazinu, Lo Bashamayim. Excuse me, in Nitzavim, Lo Bashamayim. The Torah is not in heaven, right? What's the relevance of this text? So Rabbi Yirmiyah said, since the Torah was already given at Sinai, we do not regard a divine voice In other words, we don't pay attention. God had his chance. God had his chance to convey his divine messages at Sinai, directly to Moses. Once that happened, though, the Torah and the halachic system was given to human beings in order to decipher the halacha. And if divine voice, divine intervention wants to interfere, the human beings, the poskim of the time, the Sanhedrin is not bound to listen to them. They don't listen to them, right? Because as Rav Yirmiyah points out, what did God tell Moses at Mount Sinai? Exodus 23:2, Acharei Rabim Lahatot, right? The system now that it's given in human hands is follow the majority rule. So that's what the Torah says. Since the majority of rabbis disagree with Rabbi Eliezer opinion, the halacha is not ruled in accordance with his opinion. Nothing can come from heaven that sways him otherwise. Now, interestingly enough, Tosfot on that Gemara in Bava Metzia says, is it really true that we don't pay attention to a bat kol? What exactly was the bat kol saying? What if Rabbi Eliezer is wrong, then why would the divine voice come down and say in support of Rabbi Eliezer? That's not really the halacha. So the Tosfot would say it's because it was not, since we don't paskin, we don't decide halacha based on a divine voice. The divine voice just came to defend the honor of Rabbi Eliezer. But as the Talmud itself says, it was not meant to interfere with the halachic process of Acharei Rabim Lahatot. We follow the majority rules, right? But the divine voice came down in honor of Rabbi Eliezer, but Rabbi Eliezer is still wrong. And really the halacha is like the majority. The Ran, Rabbeinu Nisim, has a very fascinating idea. He disagrees with the Tosfot, and he actually says that the bat kol intervened on behalf of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus because the absolute truth of the matter is that Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is correct, that the Tanur Shalach Dai should be tahor. However, the nature of the halachic system is that the sages of every generation can come to their conclusions based on the human effort and reason, right? And information from heaven has no place in determining the practical halacha. In order to maintain the integrity of this system, right, we have to apply the rule that we learn in Shemot chapter 23, Acharei Rabim Lahatot. We go by majority rule. Even if some sort of ideal or absolute truth would lead us otherwise, the rabbis of every generation were empowered and required to paskin, to decide the halacha as they understood it based on their human reasoning. Halachic rulings are made in this world. Lo b'shamayim. It's determined by logical deduction, not by prophetic revelation, right? And the Ran goes on to say that prophecy cannot be accessed on demand, right? If we had to rely on prophecy in order to determine the halacha, we would be bound to seek out prophecy. Well, that's a problem because prophecy is God calling us. We can't necessarily call on God to speak with us through prophecy. Furthermore, we understand that there's a point in Jewish history at which prophecy stopped. We don't have prophecy nowadays. And therefore, the Ran makes the point that halacha is not determined by prophecy or by the voice of God. It's determined by the voice of the majority of qualified halachic deciders based on the rules that were given in the Torah itself, a following majority rule. Because there won't always be prophets among the Jewish people, but there will always be the Talmud Chacham, the Posek, the halachic decider. So halachic decisions are therefore entrusted within the laps of the Talmidei Chacham. That may be the case, but when there's a divine voice, why not listen to it? In other words, we can't depend on always getting a bat kol. But when there's a bat kol, why shouldn't we rely on it, right? If we are certain that it's not anyone playing tricks on us, it's not some sort of game, It's really a divine voice, a heavenly voice that is decided like Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Why do we ignore it? So says the Abravanel that relying, that not only has the system of the Torah entrusted the majority rule, but relying on a divine message subsequent to the revelation at Sinai would erode the uniqueness of the prophecy of Sinai given to Moshe, right? We believe that the Torah was given once, and everything that we need in order to elucidate, understand, live Jewish lives according to halacha was conveyed to Moshe at that moment. If we would then rely on subsequent batkols, subsequent divine messages, says the Abravanel, it would slowly but surely erode the uniqueness of Moshe's prophecy at Sinai. And what's to say that some prophet would not emerge? And the Torah says that this is a real possibility. The false prophet will emerge and say there's a new Torah. You don't have to follow the Torah. I was given a message that there aren't 613 mitzvot, right? So there's a real concern that if we would give any credence, any authenticity to a divine voice, even if it was an authentic real divine voice, it could erode the uniqueness of the prophecy that Moshe received at Sinai. And the fact that we reject ein mashgichim avat kol, right? We don't rely on any bat kol is another way of saying that the prophecy at Har Sinai and that which was received by Moshe is unique, is unalterable throughout history. I want to show you, if we look at the bottom of page 1 into page 2, right? The Gemara relates years later, Reb Natan encountered Eliyahu the prophet. Right? We had Eliyahu Navi by Elisha ben Avuya as well. So Eliyahu the prophet was asked by Reb Natan, what did the Holy One, blessed be He, do at the time when Rabbi Yeshua issued his declaration, Lo Bashamayim He? Right? When Rabbi Yeshua rejected the divine voice that was coming in support of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, and they said, no, we don't pay attention to the divine voice. What was God doing at that time? So Elijah said, top of the next page, the Holy One, blessed be He, smiled, as it were, again anthropomorphically, and says, Nitzchuni b'ni, Nitzchuni b'ni. My children have triumphed over me. Set, right? So, in other words, up in heaven, quietly, he was supportive of the majority rule. Rav Tzvi Roshchayes, who's one of the commentaries that you can find in the back of the Vilna Shas, says it's a play on words. The word nitzchuni, nun tzadi ches, can mean triumph, a victory, but it's also related to the word netzach, eternal. And what Tzvi Roshchayes says is that the fact that Rabbi Yeshua was adamant that we do not rely on the voice from heaven was a way of assuring that the Torah from Sinai would be eternal. Right? My children, the majority against Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, have assured that my Torah will be eternal. Nitzchuni banai. Very nice play on words, an interesting idea. The Maharshal finds symbolism in each of the items that Rabbi Eliezer had appealed to prove his point. For instance, a carob tree, we know, is very deliberate, takes a long time to bear fruit, and it was a way of hinting at Rabbi Eliezer's disdain and criticism of his colleagues that they were not being bold enough or quick enough in their halachic decision making. A stream of water is understood in Jewish tradition to be a symbol of humility. Rabbi Eliezer was questioning the motivation of the majority. Why were they so bent on their opinion? Was it because they were seeking out the truth, or was it ego that prevented them from admitting their mistake that Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was actually correct? But whatever the case is, what we see is that the majority rules, that lo bashamayim he, right? That the Torah was given to humans to interpret, but not everyone is worthy of that halachic decision making, and requires proper training, proper learning, proper modality, abiding by the rules of the system, which includes majority rule. And therefore, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was out of bounds. He's not allowed to. He could have his opinion, but once his opinion was overruled, he needed to accept the fact that he was relegated to a minority opinion. Right now, minority opinions can at times be utilized for halachic practical purposes. But Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, his mistake here was that he was unwilling to be relegated to the minority. He was sure of the justness and the correctness of his logic. He felt strongly that his colleagues were incorrect, and therefore he went off. He was not willing to sit on the sidelines and accept the opinion of the majority, but he continued to fight for his opinion and was unwilling to really change. And that's why the rabbis felt a need to intervene. And here's the ban. The next page. The sages said, on that day, the sages brought all the ritually pure items deemed pure by the rulings of Rabbi Eliezer with regard to the oven and burned them in fire. And the sages reached a consensus in this regard and ostracized him. There's the ban. They put him in cherem. And the sages said, who will go and inform him of this cherem? And so they banned him. So now someone has to go and tell him. So Rabbi Akiva's a student, his beloved disciple, said to them, I will go, lest an unseemly person go and inform him in a callous and offensive manner, and he would thereby destroy the entire world. Fascinating that Rabbi Akiva was concerned with the honor of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, right? We don't really find this by Eliezer ben Avuya. Eliezer ben Avuya was outside the boundaries. We're no longer concerned with Eliezer ben Avuya being a powerful voice of authentic Judaism. But Rabbi Akiva is. Rabbi Akiva says we have to handle this very delicately, because even though Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus has not abided by the system of majority rule, he remains an incredibly wise Talmud Chacham that needs to be treated with respect. If not, we will be held liable for disgracing a Talmud Chacham, which is a tremendous liability and is punishable by terrible things. So what does Rabbi Akiva do? He wore black, wrapped himself in black as an expression of mourning and pain, sat before Rabbi Eliezer at a distance of 4 amot. In other words, he went to see his Rebbe, but he stayed away 4 amot. And that's one of the rules, that someone who's banned, someone who's in cherem, you're not allowed to get within 4 amot, about 8 feet, 6 to 8 feet of that person. Rabbi Eliezer wanted to know what's going on. Why are you sitting so far away from me, Akiva? Akiva said, it appears to me that your colleagues are distancing themselves from you, which is a euphemism. Really, he meant your colleagues are distancing you from them. They've put you in cherem. But Rabbi Akiva was very careful and deliberate and respectful with the words that he used, because Rabbi Eliezer remained, even at this moment of being banned and ostracized, Rabbi Eliezer retains his status as part of the Torah community, right? Very different than what we saw by Eliezer ben Avuya. So Rabbi Eliezer understood what was going on. He tears his garments, which is something that you do when you're put into cherem, and he dropped from his seat and sat upon the ground. He's mourning. He's in a state of mourning because he has been. That's what happens when you are put into cherem. You express mourning, and especially Rabbi Eliezer expresses mourning because he has been ostracized and removed from the Torah community. He's no longer. He's no longer accepted. Whereas the Bat Kol said that we hold like Rabbi Eliezer everywhere his opinion is mentioned. What we'll see is that in all of Shas, we only paskin like Rabbi Eliezer 4 times, right? And that's as a direct result of this Tanur Shalachnai, of this situation where he's been banned. Let's take a step back and see in the Midrashic tradition a little bit about Rabbi Eliezer's origins, his background. So, what were the origins of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus? Says the Avot Rav Natan, chapter 6, right? So, one thing we learn is he was 22 years old and he had never studied Torah. That's a very interesting idea. Perhaps one of the things we should think about is the difference between a person who comes to Torah study, right? A person later in life can become a Torah, can be a genius and come to Torah study later on in his life. 22 in the world of Torah studies late, right? So he didn't have it from his family's tradition. He didn't grow up with it. It wasn't in his mother's milk, right? He came to it later on. Right? The difference between someone who comes to Torah observance, Torah study as an adult versus someone who grew up in it. Right? When you think about the way that it just becomes second nature, certain halachic principles, the language, the rhythm, and the rituals of life. Practical halacha, the not the science of halachic adjudication, but the art that is psak, right? We just lost last month Rav David Feinstein. Well, one of the many great things about Rav David Feinstein is, in addition to his being such a great, huge Talmud Chacham, is he grew up in the house of Rav Moshe Feinstein. When you grow up in this setting, you understand there's a certain something that can't be learned from the books. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus didn't learn it from his home. He learned it from the books. He never studied Torah until he was 22 years old. The story then goes on about how his father Hyrcanus, right, was actually antagonistic towards Torah study in his home. Right, we actually contrast that to what we saw with Eliezer ben Avuya. Eliezer ben Avuya encouraged his son to become a Talmid Chacham, but for the wrong reasons. Right, Hyrcanus, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus' father, Eliezer's father, was not supportive of his son becoming a Talmid Chacham. However, finally he's won over. At first, he disowns Rabbi Eliezer and doesn't want him to inherit any of his estate. But then he goes to Jerusalem, where his son Eliezer is learning in the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the great Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he's the top student. And when Rabbi Eliezer is called upon to give an introduction to the Shir, Rabbi Yochanan kisses the forehead. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai kisses Rabbi Eliezer's forehead, and it makes Hyrcanus, Rabbi Eliezer's father, very proud. And then Hyrcanus has a change of heart and decides that he wants to give his whole estate to his son Eliezer. Eliezer says, "Thanks, but no thanks. I'll just take my share. Let my other brothers get their share." But there's a complete change of attitude by Hyrcanus, Rabbi Eliezer's father, as a result of the strides. He became a great Talmid Chacham. Like I said, he became known as Eliezer Agadol. And in Pirkei Avot, chapter 2, we're told that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 main students. And one of them was Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. And what do we know about Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus? They would say, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would say about Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, he's a plastered cistern which loses not a drop of water. Right? Water was kept in cisterns. They were covered in, they were coated in plaster so that they would be watertight. And that's what Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was. He was a sponge, right? Sponges you can squeeze out. It was a cistern. You didn't lose a drop of water. Didn't lose any drop of Torah. How was he able to do this? So the Gemara in Sukkah tells us a little bit more. Rabbi Eliezer Agadol, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus says, in all my days, no person ever preceded me to the study hall, and I was always first to arrive. Right? He got to the Beit Midrash first. Right? Can you tell me how to get to Lincoln Center? Right? How do you get there? Practice. Right? So that's what we see here. I never slept in the study hall. I never left anyone in the study hall and exited. I was always last leave, first one in, last one out. Never engaged in adult conversation. I was very focused on my studies. I discussed only necessary matters or matters of Torah. And this is a big one. I never said anything that I did not hear from my teachers. And this is, I think, in many ways, this might be key to our understanding of who Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was the type of person that Carnegie Hall. Thank you very much. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was the type of person that was very literal. Remember, he didn't have the tradition from his family's home, from his father's home, his mother's home, in terms of what the halachic process was about. He did things the way his teacher taught him. Right? I never said anything that I did not hear from my teacher. Right? So when you think about the story of the Tano Shalachnai, it would seem that Rabbi Eliezer at least thought that he was conveying the tradition of one of his teachers. And although that might have been correct, Rabbi Eliezer was less familiar with the art of psak, the need to yield to the majority. He was stuck in his ways. He was a stubborn type of person, but he was very sincere. He was sincere. He was a tremendous Talmid Chacham. But we begin to pick up some of these things that may have been at the root of what led to his obstinance that caused him to be ultimately excommunicated. And that's what we see. right? That he was excommunicated. Is it because he only came to learning at the age of 22, which is a late age? Does it have something to do with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? Another story we know, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the one that during the Roman siege, right before Jerusalem was destroyed, he left the city in a coffin, right, to meet with Vespasian and to ask to have Yavne spared. So the story is that Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was one of the students that was carrying the coffin that contained the live Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai in order to sneak out to meet with the Roman general. Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus gets ostracized, gets cherem, and then here we have the aftermath of the ban. The Gemara relates, his eyes shed a tear. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus sheds a tear. And as a result, the entire world was afflicted. 1/3 of its olives were afflicted, 1/3 of its wheat, and 1/3 of its barley. The tear that was shed by Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus as a result of being put into cherem caused a tremendous amount of damage. We don't see that by Elisha ben Avuya. Right? Elisha ben Avuya is upset, and we're happy. We're okay that he's upset because he's a sinner. He went the wrong way. He's acher. We don't see that by Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Yeah, he made a mistake, but heaven still is sensitive to his pain. Right? There's destruction that is caused in the world as a result of the pain that is caused to Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Right? There's a story here that Rabbi Gamliel, who was the Nasi, who wasn't there at the time, was on a boat on the way back, and because Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus shed a tear, there was a tremendous wave that was going to come and kill Rabbi Gamliel, because he was going to be held responsible for the pain that his colleagues on the Sanhedrin, the majority, caused Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. But however, Rabbi Gamliel defends himself, right? And he says, Master, the universe is revealed and known before you, that neither was it for my honor that I acted when I put him in cherem, nor was it for the honor of the house of my father, rather for your honor. So that this, and here's the key, right, to kind of understand where did Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus go wrong? In other words, what was so problematic about going against the majority? So that disputes will not proliferate in Israel. We have to understand this is the time of the destruction, the aftermath of the destruction of the Second Temple, right? Christianity is on the rise. There's a lot of uncertainty as to whether the Jewish people will be able to survive the end of the Second Jewish Commonwealth. Any type of fragmentation was incredibly dangerous. And Rabbi Gamliel defends his colleague's position of putting Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus in cherem in order to maintain the integrity of the halachic system and the unity of the halachic community. And in response, the sea calmed from its raging. In other words, that was taken as acceptable. However, what we see, there's an interesting story next. There's a story that Rabbi Eliezer was Rabbi Gamliel's brother-in-law. Rabbi Eliezer was married to Rabbi Gamliel's sister. And after the cherem, Rabbi Eliezer's wife, who was named Ima Shalom, who was Rabbi Gamliel's sister, would make sure that Rabbi Eliezer would never say Tachnun, right? The supplications after the Amidah in the morning and at Mincha. Because she was convinced that if he would say Tachnun and ask, God to protect him, then he would cause his antagonists, right? Those in the majority, and especially Rabbi Gamliel, to die. Rabbi Gamliel would be killed, would die by heaven as a result of the pain that was inflicted upon Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Even though heaven agreed that Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, because he was unwilling to step down, back off from his minority opinion, needed to be ostracized, needed to be banned from the Beit Midrash. But heaven was still sensitive to the pain that caused. It's fascinating, right? And therein lies, and the story goes on that it's an interesting story that one day she miscalculated. She thought it was Rosh Chodesh. So every day after Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, while he was banned, and he was banned for the rest of his life, when he got to Tachnun, she would distract him so that he wouldn't say Tachnun. And one day she thought it was Rosh Chodesh, and on Rosh Chodesh you don't say Tachnun. From here we learn you don't say Tachnun on Rosh Chodesh. So she didn't try to distract him, but it wasn't Rosh Chodesh. And he said Tachnun. And when she saw that her husband said Tachnun, he said, my brother's dead. Rabbi Gamliel is dead as a result of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus being able to say these supplications. And lo and behold, she's right. There's a shofar blast indicating the Nasi had died. And when Rabbi Eliezer asked her, how did you know that your brother died? She said as follows, right? Top of the page here, right? This is the tradition that I received from the house of my father. All the gates of heaven are apt to be locked at times, except for the gates of the prayer for victims of verbal mistreatment, right? Onat Devarim. Says Ima Shalom, you, Rabbi Eliezer, are the victim of verbal mistreatment. Not that you were the victim of an unjust ban. You were justifiably banned, ostracized, excommunicated from the halachic community because your unwillingness and obstinance in terms of accepting the opinion of the majority. However, the pain that was caused to you was incorrect and unnecessary. Rav Yaakov Emden points out that the sages may have been justified in their cherem, in their banning Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus from the Beit Midrash, but they're held liable for his pain. And he quotes the Gemara in Tanit, page 23a, which tells a story that Shimon ben Shattach said that Choni Amago, right? We know Choni, the circle drawer, right? He would draw a circle and tell God, I'm not leaving the circle until you make it rain. And God would always listen. And Shimon ben Shattach was appalled by the behavior of Choni Amago. That's not how you deal with God. You don't give God, you don't paint God into a corner. You don't force God's hand. Says Shimon ben Shattach, I would have put Choni Amago in excommunication. I would have banned him. But what can I do? God has indicated that he loves Choni Amago, right? Because he's answered his prayers, right? So I'm not going to ban him. What do we learn from that story? What's the lesson that we learn from that story? Is that that there's other ways of handling it. It's true that Choni Amago was liable for excommunication, but there's a way to circumvent it. There's a way of being sensitive. There's a way of being sensitive to the greatness of a figure like Choni Amago, like and ostensibly also like Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. So one of the interesting things here is we see it was a difficult situation. His position needed to be rejected and ostracized, and he needed to be banned because he was unwilling to step down from his position, from his idea, from his shita. However, the pain that was caused to him was unjustified, right? And the fact is that even after, what we see though is that he was not removed from the halachic community. He was banned, but his positions, his ideas remain part of the tradition, right? So the Yerushalmi has this fascinating idea. It's in Hebrew here. The Yerushalmi says that Rebbe said, "Kach shana Rebbe, Kach shana Rebbe Eliezer shona ani kidvarav el detanya machlalfin," right? Rebbe would teach the opinions of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, but not in his name. He would no longer quote it in his name, which indicates a couple of things. Number one, that the ostracizing, that the cherem was total. Not only could you not learn from him, but you cannot even quote halachas in his name. However, his Torah remained part of the traditional community, remained authentic, remained something to look to and to learn from. Right? So fascinating. Right? This is a different type of banning. He's out, but the fact that they caused him pain was noticed by heaven, and they are held to it. The Mishnah in Yadayim tells us, and this relates to one of the qualities that we had seen earlier in terms of Rabbi Eliezer being a stickler to the tradition, right? There's a story about a Rabbi Yossi who went to Lod to visit Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Eliezer asked, "What'd you learn in the yeshiva today?" And he said that there was a vote, and they decided a certain halacha about Ammon and Moab, that in those areas you have to give Meiser Ani in the 7th year in those areas of Ammon and Moab. And Rabbi Eliezer weeps. Right, here we go, right here. Right, Rabbi Eliezer wept and said, right, forget about your vote, right? This is very telling, right? Think about the story of Tano Shalachnai. Forget about your vote. I received a tradition from Yochanan ben Zakkai, who heard it from his teacher, and his teacher from his teacher all the way back to Moshe at Sinai, that the areas of Ammon and Moab are areas that are subject to the laws of Meiser Ani in the Shemitah year. Right? So Eliezer says, I don't care about the system of votes. I don't care about consensus. I don't care about majority rule. I only care about the traditions that I have from my rebbeim, from my teachers. And although that's part of the system, that's not the be-all, end-all. That's a mistake. That's a tragic mistake that Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus made. That he was so caught up in his opinion, in the truth of his opinion, in the authenticity of the tradition of his opinion, that he wasn't willing to consider other factors, especially, namely, the factor of Achari Rabbi Mahatot, we follow the majority rule, in order that we don't create more and more schisms within the Jewish people. Let's go to, right, so what could have the sages have done instead? Maybe they could have found a way to ban his idea, but honor the man, right? And what we see here is that even when you have a justifiable action, right? Like they needed to put Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus in Cherem because he wouldn't step back from his position. You still have to take into consideration the other factors, right? You can't just completely disgrace a Talmud Chacham just because you had to maintain the halachic system, right? There are competing values. And even when you are justified in choosing one value over the other, it has repercussions, right? Rabbi Gamliel dies because Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is wounded, and the day he says Tachdin is the day his brother-in-law dies because of the events that transpired. The entire world was punished because of the tear that was shed as a result of the actions taken in response to Rabbi Eliezer's obstinance, right? And it's true, Rabbi Eliezer was acting incorrectly, but the sages should have found other ways to deal with the very real issues that his obstinance presented. Let's read about the end of his life, right? We read about, this has a very similar structure, this year and this composite portrait that we're creating for Eliezer ben Hyrcanus in terms of the pieces we know, right? We know about his upbringing a little bit. We know about his early years. We know about his great wisdom. We know a precipitating event that led to his being banned. And now we know about the end of his life. That when Rabbi Eliezer took ill, Sanhedrin 68a, Rabbi Kiva and his colleagues came to visit him, but they never visited him. They just visited him here. That day was Erev Shabbos, and they thought, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus seemed very concerned that his family wasn't preparing for Shabbos appropriately. They weren't putting up the hot water. They didn't put up the blech. But they saw that even though Rabbi Eliezer was very ill, sort of on his deathbed, he was still very lucid. So since the sages perceived from his retort that his mind was stable, they entered and sat before him a distance of 4 cubits, right? The cherem was not done. He was still banned. They sat 4 amot away, but they began to engage him in halachic matters. They still looked to him for guidance. And Rabbi Eliezer says, why have you come? And they said to him, we have come to study Torah, right? They didn't want to tell him, we've come to bid you goodbye on your deathbed. Right? That's not nice, but they did want to see him. Right? They did want to somehow make amends or learn from him before he passed on. And Rabbi Eliezer is upset. Why have you not come until now, right? Why have you caused me to remain in Cherem, ostracized, banned from the Beit Midrash all this time? So they said, right, we didn't have spare time, right? That's such an excuse, right? There's always time for things that are important, right? So the fact that they say they didn't have time, and Rabbi Eliezer gets upset, he knows that that's a bad excuse. And he says something very prescient, almost prophetic, that's terrible, but ends up being the case. Rabbi Eliezer says to them, I would be surprised if these sages die their own death, a natural death. Rather, they will be tortured to death by the Romans because of the way that they dishonored, right, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Rabbi Kiva said to him, how will my death come about? And we know the answer to that. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus said, your death will be worse than theirs. You were my primary student, and you only come to me now on my deathbed. Right? We know that that's what happens, that Rabbi Kiva has one of the worst martyrdoms of them all. But many of these rabbis were killed during the Hadrianic persecutions in the aftermath of the destruction of the Second Temple. And Rabbi Eliezer, according to tradition, predicted that this would happen because of the way they treated him. And Rabbi Eliezer goes on and raises his two arms and placed them on his heart and said, woe to my two arms, they're like two Torahs. They're now being rolled up and will never be opened again. Once I die, I will not be able to share with you any of the Torah that you missed out on, that you missed out on all these years because you not only banned my position, my halachic position in that Tanur Shalachnai, but you took me out of the halachic community, perhaps unjustly. I've learned much Torah, I've taught much Torah, but even what I've learned, I've only taken a little bit from my teachers, right? Whatever I learned from my teachers was only a little bit. Again, his appeal to his allegiance to tradition, and I've taught much Torah, and my students have taken away from me, they have received from my wisdom only a tiny amount, like a paintbrush from a tube of paint. As much as I taught, I had so much more to give. Chaval, al da'avdan. Woe to us for what we lost by banning Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus from the entire community, right? And he says, I could have taught hundreds of halachas and even the most minute halacha of tzarat, but no person has ever asked me anything about them, right? This was a terrible. So they begin to ask him lots of questions. They ask him halachas about Tuma and Tara. They ask him about different items. Are they susceptible to Tuma? Are they not? Remember, he was banned because of a matter related to Tuma and Tara. Now, at the end of his life, as they bid goodbye to him, they seek out his information, his knowledge on these topics, right? The very last topic he asked for, they asked about something, is it Tameh or Tahor? And the last words out of Rabbi Eliezer's mouth is Tahor. And with that, his soul left him. And they understood that to mean that he left this world b'tahara, in purity. At that point, Rabbi Yoshua, who was leading the charge so many years earlier to ban him from the Beit Midrash, stood on his feet and said, now the vow of excommunication is permitted. The vow of excommunication is forbidden. Rabbi Eliezer didn't die. Once he died, he was no longer in a state of cherem. Contrast that to Elisha ben Avuya. Even after Elisha ben Avuya's death, we consider him have been considered to be banned until one of his students pulled him out of Gehenna, right? Check out my shir, Elisha ben Avuya, for more on that. Rabbi Eliezer's ban only lasted during his lifetime. Once he dies, he's no longer there. And then Rabbi Akiva there's a special mention of the mourning, of the tragedy of the loss of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus to his close student, Rabbi Akiva. He calls out to Rabbi Eliezer, Avi, Rechav Yisrael, right? The same language that Elisha uses when Eliyahu Hanavi goes up to heaven. My father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen, right? He says, I have many questions, but after your death, says Rabbi Akiva, I have no one who can answer them. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus laments the fact that he had much Torah to give, but no one was there to listen to him. Where have you been all this time? You're going to be punished for it. He was people. The Talmud in Bava Metzia tells us that his colleagues were punished at the time of the ostracizing, at the time of the ban, and at the end of his life, he foretells that they will continue to be punished because of the way they handled the situation. And just as Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus laments the fact that he had much to give, but no one to give it to, Rabbi Akiva says, I have many questions, but now after your death, I have no one who can answer them. Right? Chaval. You think about the mourning student of Reb Meir in the story of Elisha ben Avuya, and the mourning student Rabbi Akiva in the story of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein explained that the tragedy of the story of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was that the Chachamim came out not only against his idea by Tanur Shalachnai, but against him personally. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus cries on his deathbed due to the isolation that came about as a result. And he expresses anger at the Torah that went to waste because of the long-standing ban. No one accepted his teachings. His students, at the end of his life, appreciated the tragedy. They're filled with regret that they did not find a way to keep Eliezer ben Hyrcanus within the halachic community, even while forcing him to abide by the law, by the rules of the game of halacha, of following majority rule, right? He should have conceded, right? Rabbi Eliezer should have conceded. But even though he wouldn't, his colleague should have found a better way, a different way, in order to keep him as a resource, bring him back over. His stubborn insistence on an individual's right to stand up for his opinion could have destroyed, could have created the machloket, Marbin machloket b'Yisrael, like Rabbi Gamliel said, to heaven, which caused him not to be swallowed up by the large wave that we saw earlier. The Rambam says that had this story occurred during the times of the Beit Midrash, Rav Eliezer ben Hyrcanus would have been under the category of a Zakin Mamre, a rebellious elder who's liable for the death penalty, right? And Rav Lichtenstein suggested that maybe this was the point of contention. Remember that we're dealing with the aftermath of the destruction of the Second Temple. Perhaps there was a dispute between Rav Eliezer ben Hyrcanus and his colleagues. Do the rules of Zakin Mamre apply when the Sanhedrin is not meeting in the Beit HaMikdash and the Lishkat HaGazit and during exile? Right, this is a question, right? Some people say, why can't we rely on minority opinions? Who gives the right? Why is there consensus now? There's no Sanhedrin. There should be more diversity of opinion now. But that's exactly what happened. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus said, I'm not bound by the majority in the aftermath of the temple's destruction. But the rabbis were adamant with Rabbi Gamliel at the head and Rabbi Yeshua as his assistant, and all the rest of the colleagues said no. Perhaps especially in the aftermath of the temple's destruction, we need to maintain that law, that rule of majority rule, so that we do not splinter into many different communities. As a result, Rabbi Eliezer needed to be excommunicated. But perhaps they should have found this tragedy of the story is not only Rabbi Eliezer's obstinance, not only his misunderstanding of how the traditional, the way psak goes, but the tragedy was in the way that his colleagues handled the situation. And his students and his colleagues feel deep regret, says Rav Lichtenstein, for maintaining the cherem, even though it was necessary. Right? Fascinating idea. There are some homiletic interpretations of what the machloket was between Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus and his colleagues. Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin, who was the elder contemporary of Moshe Feinstein, was the head of Ezra's Torah. He said that the dispute between Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus and his colleagues was whether to fight the Romans, right? Rabbi Yeshua and his colleagues said that it was better to take up arms and fight against the Romans. But Rabbi Eliezer held no, that the situation was broken and there was no going back. His grandson, Rabbi Yehuda Henkin, understood the dispute differently. And he said that the dispute was if a Jew makes a mistake and is alienated from his community, right? Rabbi Yeshua and the colleagues and the majority opinion is that they can still be whole, they can still be reconnected. In other words, the Tanur Shalachnai can be Mikabel Tuma because you can put the pieces back together. So too, a Jew who makes a mistake can come back. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer said no. Once the schism is created, once there's this dispute, once it's broken, it can't be put back together. And perhaps Rabbi Eliezer's attitude contributed to his permanent cherem. It led to his obstinance. He said, similar to Elisha ben Avuya, was self-defeating, right? This feeling that, I made my bed, now I have to lay in it, right? I rejected the idea of Achrei Rabbi Mahato, majority rule. I'm convinced that I'm right, and now I'm going to be stuck in this cherem. So there's blame to be placed on Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, no doubt. But the lesson that some of the lessons that we learned from Eliezer ben Hyrcanus relate to how to navigate colleagues with rabbinic colleagues. And I think one of the lesson I wanted for us to emerge is how do you deal with difficult situations? Eliezer ben Hyrcanus needed to be put into cherem, but he needed to be put into cherem in an appropriate way. Perhaps in a way that he would have learned from his mistake, perhaps in a way that he would have recanted and remained part of the halachic community, remained a resource that Rabbi Akiva and the others could have learned from all those years, instead of having regret when he was about to die and after his death. Let's end with some of his teachings that seem to indicate this as well. Pirkei Avot, right? Let the honor of your friend be as dear to you as your own. Do not be easily provoked to anger. Repent one day before your death, right? These are all good lessons. But the one I want to focus on, and maybe some of those lessons as well, may relate to the story of, in terms of some of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus' mistakes, some of the things he could have done differently. But here's the kicker. Warm yourself before the fire of the wise, right? Benefit from the fire, from the benefit that is wise people. But beware of being singed by their glowing coals. For their bite is the bite of a fox, their sting is the sting of a scorpion, their hiss is the hiss of a serpent, and all their words are like coals of fire, right? Being a part of a community is a double-edged sword. You can warm yourself from the familiarity and the warmth of that community, of the Talmidei Chachamim involved in it, but beware of being singed by the glowing coals. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was singed by his colleagues. He was bitten, he was stung, right? So it's interesting that this is one of the lessons that is part of the legacy of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, not just in terms of the story of his being banned from the Beit Midrash, but also in his lessons in Birkei Avot. Finally, the Gemara in Brachot used to say, be vigilant in the honor of your counterparts. Something that one could suggest his counterparts were not careful in. They weren't careful enough in the honor due to Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Also, prevent your children from logic when studying verses intent towards heresy. In other words, don't allow your children to rely exclusively on their own logic. This may have been one of the mistakes. If the mistake of his colleagues was not honoring their counterpart enough, perhaps we could suggest that one of the mistakes that Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus made was relying too heavily on his own logic. Place your children while they're still young instead between the knees of Torah scholars. This can be understood in one of two ways. According to the mistake of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, this means that I accept the tradition of my Rebbe and I pay no attention to the traditions of others, even if the others are the majority opinion. However, the way to learn it correctly within the halachic tradition, the authentic way of learning this, is that when that place yourself within the rules and subject yourself to the rules that govern the halachic system as brought down from Sinai to Moshe. When you pray, know before him who you stand. For doing that, you will merit the life of the world to come. There's no indication at the time of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus' death, the cherem is removed, and certainly he had a place in the world to come. And when he got to the world to come, you wonder what he saw in the Olam HaEmet. I'll just leave you with this. In the Olam HaEmet, what did Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus learn from his experience? Did he learn that he shouldn't have been so obstinate? Did he learn that he should have been more yielding and subject himself to the majority? Did he learn that he was justified in holding a grudge, that his colleagues made a mistake, that they should have been able to excommunicate the position without excommunicating the person, that they should have found a way to bring him back? Was he correct that they should have brought him back into the community earlier? What did he learn? What did he learn in the Olam HaEmet? I think all of these are lessons that we can learn for ourselves from the experience, very different from Elisha ben Avuya, the story of Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. He too was banned from the Beit Midrash, but he is viewed as a figure that remains part of the halachic community. And those that banned him are put to task and are questioned if they actually did it correctly. They were justified, but could they have done it in a slightly different way that would have had different outcomes? All right, we will stop there. Let me just check the chat, see if there's any discussion in the chat. Let me turn off my share. And if there are any questions, I'll take them now.